Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas, and I am an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a series of lectures on Alasdair MacIntyre's book, Dependent Rational Animals, published by Open Court in 1999. The lecture series will cover each chapter, some of them together, but most of them independently, and will conclude with a criticism of MacIntyre's project. The criticism will be mostly accepting MacIntyre's conclusions and objections within this book, but raising some questions that still need to be answered. In this first lecture of the series, we will be discussing why this book is needed now and why MacIntyre is taking up the arguments that he takes up in this book. So MacIntyre wants to ask about the relationship between human animals and non-human animals. He wants to say, what is it that we find? Why is it important to attend to and to understand what human beings have in common with members of other intelligent animal species? Often we never discuss these things. Certainly, Western philosophy does not often discuss these things. We see the relationship between non-human and human animals discussed by Aristotle, by Thomas Aquinas, and a few others, but hardly ever until late in the 20th century, when we begin to see arguments about environmental justice and animal rights. And even then, the discussion about the relationship between human and non-human animals is couched in a way that separates rather than examines what we have in common, particularly with our intelligent animal cousins, such as dolphins, wolves, bears, etc. And the second question that MacIntyre wants to ask in this book is, what makes attention to human vulnerability and disability important to moral philosophers? And again, this is another question which is rarely asked in philosophy, not even by Aristotle, although he does consider some of those issues. But it has been asked in the late 20th century, particularly by feminists and other people concerned with disability studies. So these are the sorts of questions that foreground MacIntyre's discussion. And so what he wants to do is think about the human animal in relationship both to our intelligence and our vulnerability and disability. So that sets up the framework for how this book works. Now, part of what he's doing here is correcting some earlier errors in his magnum opus, or what many people consider his magnum opus, After Virtue. Its third edition was published in 2007, but it was originally published in 1981. And this is really signifying a turning point in MacIntyre's work. And if you watch some of the other videos on my YouTube channel, you'll see that there's a discussion about MacIntyre's Marxism and discussions about his Thomism. What After Virtue does is it steps back from the Marxism of MacIntyre's earlier years and embraces an Aristotelianism which will later develop into his Thomistic Aristotelianism. The main features of After Virtue is a diagnosis of the failures of modernity, and so in particular he takes aim at emotivism, and if you want to know more about emotivism, you can look at my lectures on YouTube channels. He poses Nietzsche against Aristotle, and so what we will see towards the end of Dependent Rational Animals is another discussion of Nietzsche. And he reinterprets Aristotle without Aristotle's metaphysical biology. And so what we see with Dependent Rational Animals is a re-engagement with biology, but from a different kind of perspective. So what After Virtue does is it provides a new ground of virtues for the modern world. So most discussions of ethics and politics within the 20th century took place within either a deontological framework, which one might associate with Kant, or within a utilitarian framework, which one might associate with Mill or with modern economics. And Aristotle was primarily forgotten for a long time until others, like Martha Nussbaum and Alasdair MacIntyre, began to reinvestigate Aristotle's virtue ethics. And what MacIntyre does in After Virtue is talk about things like practices, narrative unity of life, and tradition. And while he will only use the term practice within the book Dependent Rational Animals, he does presume the concepts of practices, narrative unity of life, and tradition throughout this book. And certainly that narrative unity of life will come in the second half of Dependent Rational Animals. And then finally, he ends After Virtue by arguing that we need to look at local communities, and in particular, we need to find new ways of being in community. And what Dependent Rational Animals does is really foreground that desire for new ways of being in community against the background of virtues. So the idea of community and local community becomes much more important here within the context of vulnerability and dependency and our relationship to non-human animals, particularly intelligent non-human animals. And so the community is going to be a ground within which we as Homo sapiens, as human animals, address our vulnerability and dependency and realize our animality through realizing our practical rationality. So we might ask, if After Virtue didn't discuss human nature and he defended virtues independent of human nature, why is it now that we're returning to human nature? Why is it now that we're starting to pay attention to biology? And MacIntyre admits that he made a mistake in After Virtue. He now realizes that it's important to understand that beings who have a life like ours, who are independently rational, are constituted biologically. And we can't understand that independent rationality without understanding our biological constitution, right? So we can't understand what kind of goods we have, what kind of rules we have to follow, what kind of virtues are necessary for life without understanding ourselves as biologically constituted animals of a particular kind, right? And in fact, what happens with most philosophy, as I said, is they ignore vulnerability and they ignore our animality, and that means they obscure important elements of human development, which we will look at in the second half of the book. And secondly, MacIntyre comes to realize that even though Aristotle did not look at human dependency plays an important role for Thomas Aquinas. And so between 1981 and 1999, MacIntyre has transformed his Aristotelianism into this Thomistic Aristotelianism, which becomes characteristic of his philosophy after that. And so he's going to become much more influenced by what Thomas Aquinas says in these ideas. Of course, MacIntyre's arguments stand on their own. So when I say he's a Thomistic Aristotelian, what I mean is he's not saying Aristotle was right and Thomas Aquinas was right. He is saying they were right because, and he's giving his own reasons for why we should look at Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, who I will refer throughout these lectures as Thomas, not Thomas Aquinas. He wants to defend them for the 20th century and the 21st century. And so we want to pay attention to those kinds of arguments. He's not saying listen to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas because they were great philosophers. Now, a couple of things that MacIntyre is not discussing in this book are things that we might think belong here, but he wants to keep his framework simple and less complex. So he's not going to talk about human identity very much. He's not going to talk about human perception. Perception was a great subject that Aristotle discussed in his De Anima. MacIntyre's not going to talk about that. He's not going to discuss the relationship of evaluative to factual judgment. That's something that's discussed in After Virtue and later on in some other text. And then he's not going to discuss the psychological reality of certain types of character traits. So those are things that are off the table in this discussion. We're looking more at issues of vulnerability, dependency, and what it means to be an independent practical reasoner. Now, I've divided the book into two major parts, and then individual parts that follow after that. This is my analysis of the argument. Obviously, you don't see this just by looking at the titles of the chapters. I've given you the page numbers there for the chapters. Other people might divide up the book differently, but I think it really divides into two parts. One is, what is our relationship to other animals? That takes up the first half of the book. Not really full half, but most of that first half. And then the second part is, what is involved in becoming independent practical reasoners? And in the first half, we have a lot of discussion about our relationship with non-human animals and what kind of capacities for reason giving that animals have, non-human animals have. That will become important for understanding what it means to become a human independent practical reasoner. And there we have a breakdown into goods and vulnerability and the virtues that are required there and the common goods. I think in particular, many people will question my outline of the last third of the book, where I take common goods there as a subset of the discussion of independent practical reasoners. While I think that the common good is a subject independently worthy of its own discussion, I think in the context of this book, it falls under the purview of independent practical reasoner. And so we need to keep that relationship in mind as we go through this discussion. MacIntyre does write about common goods in other articles, but and in his last book, published in 2017, the ethics and the conflicts of modernity, but he never really addresses it quite independently from these other kinds of conversations, except in articles. And he doesn't really address the common good in After Virtue. But we do want to pay attention to how he thinks about the common goods in terms of becoming these independent practical reasoners. And so part of what we're going to be thinking about there is a vulnerability and dependency, and our capacity for intelligence. All right, so that's the overview of what we're going to be looking at in this lecture series, and an overview of MacIntyre's book. And I hope this is helpful for framing the book as you read through it, and for thinking about the topics that I will cover in future lectures. Thank you.